Hello, everybody. Terrence Lahue here with another episode of The Intellectual Agrarian, where we talk philosophy from the farm. Do you ever get frustrated with all the labels at the grocery store? Stuck trying to decide between non-GMO, organic, and natural products? It's a problem that our guest today works to solve. Melinda Hemmelgarn is a registered dietitian, food advocate, and host of the Food Sleuth Radio show. Together, we have a great conversation covering what a dietitian does, how she became involved in sustainable agriculture, how to cut out the green noise, and much, much more. You don't want to miss this interview with Melinda Hemmelgarn. Melinda, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Before we get too far underway, would you mind sharing a brief biographical sketch with the audience?
Well, sure. I guess the best way to describe myself would be that I am a registered dietitian, but I am very much a consumer advocate and an advocate for organic and agroecological farming methods.
So I think that might lead to some confusion for some people when they hear the word registered dietitian. Would you mind explain to us what exactly is it a registered dietitian does, and why did you become one?
Well, I became one quite by accident. I really wanted to be an art major, but I think I lacked some of those essential skills. And I ended up taking, by accident again, a course in nutrition. And it was that very first class that I took that I absolutely fell in love with. But what registered dietitians do essentially is we study food and how it can both prevent and cure disease. And so we look at food truly as medicine, and it is so powerful and I think under-recognized and underutilized in our society. But dietitians study things like microbiology, anatomy and physiology, food science, and as well as how food interacts with all of our different body systems on a biochemical level. So most of us have at least a bachelor's, but a master's degree as well. And then we have to do an internship and then keep up with continuing education, so 75 credits every 5 years. Unfortunately, the profession has been infiltrated quite a bit by big food and big ag. This is not new. The Home Economics Association was infiltrated by big food decades ago. But we are really the frontline people who interface with consumers. And so if somebody is confused, for example, about, well, what does organic mean, or which kind of fat should I be using, or what about protein or carbohydrate or fat requirements for me, we're the people that the consumer goes to. And then we also work in schools, we work in with industry, we work in hospitals most commonly, but we are the people that help our patients and clients and consumers make sense of the food system.
There's a lot to touch on there, but first and foremost, I just think it's interesting you started with art because a lot of the farmers I know are creatives, and they've taken that and applied it to their farming. And even myself and kind of what I do, I'm a literary guy, and that's kind of how I started doing this. I just think it's interesting that art, people really don't tend to acknowledge how that applies so much to all the other disciplines. What's his name? Come on. Walter Isaacson recently wrote a book, Leonardo da Vinci. Of course, how could I forget that name? He was an artist, but he took everything and applied it to the sciences and anatomy. So I just think that's fascinating connection there.
I do too, and I think that we are better off not working in silos and recognizing ourselves and our society as being much more web-like and circular, and understanding that everything is connected, having more of a holistic ecological mindset. And it's so interesting because I was at the Bioneers Conference a couple of years ago. I was so lucky to be invited to help Organic Valley do some promotion of their great work. And there was a session by an artist who explained that in order to change policy, which of course creates the structure under which we all live, but in order to influence policy, we have to change the way people think. And the way we change the way we change how people think is through art. And I had this aha moment. It was like bingo, it was like, yes. And of course, literature and words are all part of art, whether we're talking about visual art or language arts. It's all about influencing how we think about food and farming.
And that's a great way of looking at it, which is one of the things I'm actually really impressed. Quick plug for your husband's project. He works with photography with farming, and I've seen some of the pictures. They're gorgeous. I mean, once again, it's art. And I think that agriculture really does need more of that agriculture. And that's another great way of doing that.
Well, it's interesting how that project started, and I'll step back and just say another beauty of art is that it touches the emotions. And here I am, a food educator, and I'm the first one to say, really the last thing we probably need is more education. I don't know anybody who doesn't know the basics of, we need to eat more fruits and vegetables. Granted, who doesn't know that? But it's the emotional appeals that really sell us on a lot of the kinds of foods and activities that are harmful to our planet and therefore us. But how the Farm Project started, and it's Farm is short for Food Art Revolution Media. It started because we wanted to raise money for our local farmers market. And so we thought, well, how can we do this? Well, we wanted to create a calendar, and each month featured the hands of working farmers. And I find hands to be so beautiful, especially working hands. They tell a story. And so my husband photographed the hands, and I did the interviews. And they were based on three main questions that I wanted to amplify farmers' voices. I wanted to know about, why they farm, what their pleasures were, but also what their challenges were, because the challenge piece goes back to policy. And I can work on policy. I can be a policy advocate. I can help amplify those needs. For example, if you look at the new Young Farmers survey that came out, what is preventing young farmers from getting on the land? It's access to land, it's access to resources, and it's also access to health care. So that tells me as a health educator what I need to work on to get good food into people. So that's how the project started. We sold thousands of dollars worth of calendars, but more importantly, we amplified farmers' voices and just engaged in this so rewarding arts project. And we continue that work at different levels.
So what were those three main questions, if I can ask?
Yeah, sure. So the three questions were, what do you love about your work? What are your greatest challenges? And what do you want the world to know?
That's awesome. I may be borrowing those questions just so you're aware ahead of time.
Please do. Yes. Yeah. We need to be asking more questions, I think.
So food as medicine, that's a great concept. Mm-hmm. It's definitely one that I think has been better known in the East, and in the West, we've kind of lost it in some cases. But when did you first tie that food as medicine to how it was raised?
Well, I had an exceptional opportunity for which I am so grateful, and that was to be a Food and Society Policy Fellow. And that fellowship really allowed me to understand the importance of how food is produced. And you'd think that being a dietitian, part of my curriculum would be on food production. You'd think that maybe a soil science class would have been part of the curriculum, but it wasn't. And, I think that that's changing today. But at the time, and, you've got to remember, I became a dietitian back in 1980. At the time, we weren't looking at soil. We weren't getting out of our silos. So we were looking mostly at macronutrients and micronutrients, and we were looking at how different food components impact health, but we weren't looking at how farming methods impacted food quality. I'm glad to say that I'm a member of a practice group in the dietetics field that does indeed look at food and agriculture together. But it was that Kellogg Fellowship that really opened my eyes to the importance of agriculture and the way, the chemicals that are applied, conservation methods, soil, air, water, all of those critical components.
Because it really does matter. I mean, I don't think that can be stressed enough that how your
I
food is
agree.
raised matters. I see a couple of shows every now and again where these people are like eating these weird foods, etc. And what they really don't appreciate is, especially like meat. Meat is a sore point for me. If you eat some kind of strange meat, it's going to taste even worse if it wasn't raised eating what it's supposed to. I mean, the fact is,
Right.
a bison will taste more like an actual bison if it's raised on what a bison would eat, not stuffing it full of corn.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think it's so interesting that, ruminants were meant to eat grass and pasture, and that's how they're healthiest. And then, of course, what's healthiest for the animal, what's healthiest for the planet and the earth is going to naturally be what's healthiest for us. And I think, unfortunately, we've externalized many of the costs so that people think, cheap food is somehow good. I always like to mention that cheap food is really based on exploitive practices. And when people say, well, I just can't afford that quote unquote better food, I think that we have to go back and say, well, why can't you afford good food? What's wrong in our economic system that prevents you from having the dignity of feeding yourself and your family well?
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a really good point because people really don't pay attention to how much agriculture is a part of economics. I enjoy reading the American Agricultural Economics Journal. That's like one of my things.
That's
And
great.
if we had a system in which it allowed people to feel like they could raise their own food, what a difference. What a difference that
Yeah.
would make. Do you drink coffee, water, tea, or liquids of any kind? Good news! We've got an idea that holds liquids of any kind. The Intellectual Agrarian Mug. You can drink out of a beautiful white mug with our Intellectual Agrarian Shield logo on both sides. A beautiful white mug capable of holding any kind of liquid, hot or not, and conveying it stylishly to your mouth. Impress your family and friends around after dinner coffee by saying, it's pronounced agrarian. Now available on our Facebook page in the shop section. Buy yours today. Find it at facebook.com/intellectual agrarian or click on the link in the show notes. On your show, you also, in the description, you talk about helping people think beyond their plates, which is great, and discover food truth. What do we mean when we say food truth?
So I think, in a nutshell, it means cutting through a lot of the green noise, a term that I borrowed from one of my interviewees.
I love that.
Urvashi Rangan, who was formerly with Consumers Union, she used that term in an interview, and I thought, oh, Urvashi, I want to borrow that. That's beautiful. So cutting through that green noise, helping consumers see through the rhetoric and the propaganda to help them feed themselves and their families well. It's something that we all want. I think we take for granted our health until something happens to it. And I've always been a consumer advocate and looking out for, the voiceless and the people who really don't have much say in their lives. I want to help improve the quality of their lives. I think to whom much is given, much is expected.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to help consumers make the best choice to improve the quality of their lives. And that's what finding food truth really means. A really good example of this would be some of the misleading labels. We've been just inundated with so many messages about, feed the world, and we need genetically modified foods to somehow feed the world and, get around some of the crises that our planet is facing. But what a lot of people don't realize is that most of the genetically modified food on the market today has simply been modified to withstand the spraying of herbicides, which is harming our children and harming our water quality and, gosh, so many unintended consequences, harms to pollinators and birds and soil microorganisms. So that's one of the areas that I've really focused on helping to, pull back the curtain and help people see the truth.
Have you heard of Nicholas Nassim Taleb?
No.
Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He was a day trader. He wrote The Black Swan, a book about basically a financial crisis before the financial crisis happened. But he actually wrote a paper on GMOs and the precautionary principle. And in summary, he basically said, let's look at it this way. If something went wrong with a GMO, it is more dangerous because of how integrated the food system is than if a nuclear bomb went off. Because we know what the repercussions of a nuclear bomb going off is, but we don't know what the repercussions are if one of these GMOs go wrong. And it could affect an unknown told amount of people.
Right. Well, I'm a big supporter of the precautionary principle. You know, the precautionary principle basically states that you act with caution and you can take precautionary action even if all of the research isn't in yet. You know, so often we are, convinced that, well, we need more research. Well, how much more research do we need? I think we should take the road that says let's make sure that our families are safe and our children are safe before we launch into accepting something that could result in harm.
Absolutely. Now, on your site, you also discuss the phrase food system literacy, which that's a great way of saying it. What does it mean, and how can people become more food system literate?
Well, for me, food system literacy is really a bundle of literacies put all together. So environmental literacy, economic and ecological literacy, understanding how all of the pieces fit together, agricultural literacy, as well as media literacy, which is an area that I investigated many years ago when I was trying to reduce childhood obesity rates. That was a big part of my work. It was the focus of my master's thesis. But what it basically means is applying critical thinking skills and this overarching ecological holistic way of thinking to see how everything is connected, but providing critical questions that we might apply to media, we're going to apply them to our food system. So we ask a basic set of questions. Where does my food come from? Who produced it? Who owns and profits from any technology that's applied? Under what conditions was my food grown or produced? And in other words, were workers treated fairly? Were animals treated humanely? What's in or on my food or not? And that is a very simple question, but it's extremely difficult to find out. Once you start digging, you want to find out, well, where was my food packaged? What's in the packaging? What did the animals eat? Were they given antibiotics, hormones? What pesticides exactly were sprayed on my foods? And, what are the unintended consequences of my food and therefore farming choices? How might the food choices I make in the supermarket or at the farmer's market affect the environment as well as future generations?
And that's so important to ask those questions because in our world, we always think about applying critical thinking to everything, but food always comes up last.
Yeah. We can change that.
We can, and that's why we do things like this.
That's my mission, exactly, and yours as well.
What are some common misconceptions that people, consumers, have about their food system?
I'm so glad you asked me that. So the genetic engineering, of course, is a huge one. The idea that we somehow need technology to feed the world. I think that the Food and Agriculture Organization has produced multiple reports showing us that smallholder farms are really quite powerful in producing food for our local communities, regional food systems, and beyond. Another big misconception would have to be the natural label, which means pretty much nothing. Whereas the certified organic label has a set of legal standards that the farmers must comply with in order to have that seal on their food. So that's one that I certainly approach with consumer education models. I think people think that if it's on the market, if it's on the shelf, it must be safe. So going through some of the safety issues are certainly important. Misconceptions like, BPA-free can, that must be safe now. Well, actually, some of the substitutes that have been used for BPA, like BPS, might have endocrine disrupting qualities as well. So There are many, many areas of consumer misconception, but those are some of the big ones.
Oh, boy. And I'm thinking I need to throw out my blender bottle. Uh, what are some simple first steps for people if they want to change and improve their diet? I know this is a question that's important to me. I'm trying to eat a little bit healthier this year. I mean, more so than I already do, but what are some simple steps for people to take?
Well, I think, one of the most basic steps is to learn to cook and to introduce cooking early on. I was just on a webinar. I'm very interested in media literacy, as I mentioned earlier, and there was just a webinar a few days ago by the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood, and there were very disturbing statistics showing how much time youth spend with media and how media is driving a wedge between children and their parents, and how important it is for us to stay connected for children's both mental and physical health. And one of the best ways to bond with children is in the kitchen. And I've always taught my children, who are now, well on their way into young adulthood, but I always taught them that learning how to feed yourself and cooking is as vital a skill as learning how to swim. So it is truly the first step in protecting our health. And taking children to the library, getting basic cookbooks, maybe some fun stories to read about food and cooking is a great first step. And I also think it's important for people to try to reach out to local farmers and look for some of those underground, below-the-radar ways to get good food. I am very lucky. I live in Columbia, Missouri. We have a wonderful farmers market. In fact, we have multiple farmers markets. And I can buy food directly from the farmer, eliminating that middleman and eliminating the time between harvest and consumption, which is critical for maintaining nutritional integrity. So finding local sources of food, growing some of our own food, yet another miracle for children. Even if you live in an apartment building and you think you don't have a way to grow your own food, I recommend just having a pot of herbs on your windowsill, looking for community garden space where you can bond with others and learn growing skills. Just growing your own tomato and learning the beauty and good taste of food through your own hands is vitally important. And also, if you're going to go to the grocery store and buy packaged or processed foods, to learn the language, the intricacies of ingredient labels. Ingredients have to be listed in order of predominance. So if the first ingredient listed on a label is sugar, that means you're getting more sugar in that product than anything else.
Mm-hmm. It's very important to, isn't it? I think it was Michael Pollan that said if your grandmother wouldn't recognize an ingredient, you probably shouldn't be eating it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very basic way to help people understand how much we've been processing foods and how little our grandparents did. And you bring up a really good point, and that is oftentimes when I'm thinking about, well, what is the best diet to recommend to people, I recommend that we go back and think about what our ancestors ate. Now, realize that, hundreds of years ago, people may not have lived as long as we might be living today for multiple reasons. But I think about what my grandparents did, and I know that they cooked. They didn't rely on processed foods because they weren't there. And so they knew how to choose a healthy bird in the marketplace or how to make bread or how to cook vegetables and make delicious foods. Cooking is just such a wonderful art and science, and it's such a good way to bring families together.
And it's so important in a farming context because it really is that end result. From farm to fork or paddock to plate, as some people say, when it goes into the ground, when you have the opportunity to know that it went to the ground, know the person that raised it, and then cook it and feed it, it gives you that overwhelming, it is that art. It is the satisfaction of a completion of a job well done.
And I can't imagine a better way to show love than by feeding people, and feeding people food that you've taken care to produce. Shortly after my Kellogg Fellowship, I started putting when I had a dinner party or just friends over for dinner, even my own family, I started labeling the food as to who produced it, where it came from. And I remember the first time my daughter came home from college with some of her friends, and I did this. She was just delighted. It was, oh my gosh, this is so unique. And one of my good friends, also a fellow dietitian, Angie Tagtow, who had worked at USDA, she did the same thing at a dinner party. And it was allowing a connection to be made to our food that we hadn't previously considered.
That is wonderful. I'm going to have to steal that for my next dinner party. Melinda, thanks so much. We could go on and on, I'm sure. But is there anything you'd like to share with the audience as we wrap up?
I want to thank you so much for helping to amplify messages. I think it's very important for people all, especially during this time of great urgency, whether we're talking about, public health urgencies, whether we're talking about planetary climate issues. Let's all share our voices. And if we know a part of the food system intimately, let's share our experiences so that we can all be better connected and informed.
Thanks again so much. Everyone needs to go look at the Food Sleuth, the Farm Project. All of that stuff will be linked in the show notes. Thanks again, Melinda.
Thank you so much.
And have a great day.
Pleasure.
Hopefully we can have you on the show again sometime.
Wonderful. Happy New Year, everyone.
Big thanks to Melinda for coming on the show today. Great conversation. We hope that this has helped you find food truth also. Please share your takeaways with us by emailing us at show@intellectualagrarian.com. You can also find links to Melinda's work in the show notes. There you'll also find breakdowns of some of the topics we've covered and the resources we've referenced. I encourage you also to take a look at the farm project that Melinda and her husband Dan worked on. That will also be linked in the notes. If you enjoy the show, be sure to subscribe on whatever listening medium you use. iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Podbean, Overcast, CastBox, whichever suits your preference. While you're there, please leave us a nice review, letting us know and others know that you like the show. As always, I'm Terrence Leahy. This has been the Intellectual Agrarian, reminding you to keep farming the dream.